Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich is joined by one of our favorite recurring guests and one of the most knowledgeable analysts about Big Ten basketball, and that is Dylan Burkhardt, who you may know from UMHoops if you follow the Michigan program closely, but also from the Moving Screen podcast, where he and Brendan Quinn do a really good job of breaking down not only Michigan and Michigan State, but the entire Big Ten. And Dylan actually has recently launched a newsletter about Big Ten basketball that I highly recommend. So you can go subscribe to it for free at dylanburkhardt.substack.com. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but it's dylanburkhardt.substack.com. If you go to the show notes for this episode at insidethehall.com, Podcast on the Brink, episode number 311, you'll find a link for it there. But I subscribe to it. It's really, really good insight on the Big Ten. So it's not just about Michigan and Michigan State, but it's all about the Big Ten. And it's really, really good stuff. So listen to the Moving Screen pod, subscribe to that newsletter, and of course, enjoy this conversation. Alex and Dylan talk for almost an hour. I unfortunately wasn't able to be part of it, which is a real bummer because I love talking hoops with Dylan. But, you know, fortunately with me not being here, you got an expert on the entire conference to talk with you. So it's really your gain, your win, I think. But definitely missed not being able to have this conversation. But Alex and Dylan take a deep dive into Indiana's upcoming matchups this week against Michigan State and Maryland. Why hasn't it been smooth sailing so far for Michigan State this season? Who other than Cassius, Winston, Xavier, Tillman should Indiana fans really pay attention to? And from a Maryland perspective, why have they been so bad on the road? You know, especially they just escaped at Northwestern, but really played poorly for most of the night. And, you know, why are Terp fans just probably unlikely to ever be fully happy with Mark Turgeon? And they talk about the Big Ten big picture. Can the conference get 12 teams in the tournament? What does the Big Ten Player of the Year race look like? And a lot more. So a really, really great episode of Podcast on the Brink here for you this week with Dylan Burkhardt. Enjoy this episode. Right now, some of you are going to get an ad. Others of you will jump right into the conversation. But either way, here we go. Alex Bozich, Dylan Burkhardt talking IU, Michigan State, Maryland, and the rest of the Big Ten.
And I'm back rolling solo again this week on Podcast on the Brink. Got a special guest, one of my favorite guests, one of my favorite basketball writers, people in general. Dylan Burkhardt, the author, editor over at UMHoops. He also has recently started a Big Ten email newsletter, which I definitely recommend checking out. I think you can find links to that over on the UMHoops Twitter page. But Dylan, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. Happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Excited to talk some Big Ten hoops.
So a pretty big week coming up for Indiana, obviously, with Michigan State coming to town on Thursday night and Maryland on Sunday afternoon. The Michigan State game is going to be primetime, 8:30, FS1. Sunday afternoon, CBS game with Maryland. So both should be, obviously, have a lot of national eyes on both games, but I kind of wanted to talk about both of these opponents, and we'll start with Michigan State. And I know you're very familiar with them just because of the podcast that you do every week with Brendan Quinn, the Moving Screen. But Michigan State, to me, has been an interesting team to follow this year. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I think I've only watched them a handful of times this year, and it seems like every time I've watched them, they've lost. I remember watching them against Kentucky to open the season, the Virginia Tech game in Maui. I know I watched some of the Purdue game early on, and then once it became obvious it wasn't going to be much of a contest, I think I tuned out on that one. But Michigan State is a team that, they still look like the clear favorite to me to win the Big Ten, despite the kind of the obstacles that they've had to overcome, a lot of them out of their control with, the tragic passing of Cassius Winston's brother and the adversity that they've come through with that. But just overall right now, where do you think Michigan State is as a team in terms of their progress this year? And what can Indiana fans expect out of this group that's coming to Bloomington on Thursday night?
Yeah, well, I can say after watching Michigan State up close and personal on the baseline for that Michigan State game that at their best, this team can still be good enough to make a long run in March. Obviously, they stumbled a bit in the non-conference, but if you look closer at what happened, losing to Duke, Kentucky, and Virginia Tech, it's not like a season breaker, right? They won at Seton Hall in the non-conference. That's one of the best non-conference wins that anyone picked up this year. And now they're really rocking and rolling here, basically sitting at 6-1 in the Big Ten in kind of a weird spot where they've played 5 of their first 7 games at home. So they've had a great opportunity to build confidence, to find themselves. Now they just have to prove that they can go on the road and win. And that's, you said it's a big week coming up for Indiana, but it's also a huge week coming up for Michigan State. Michigan State goes to Indiana, goes to Minnesota. Those are 2 road games that I think, from a Michigan State perspective, they feel they should and can win. And Tom Izzo called it a separation week for them. This is a week where I think if Michigan State goes 2-0, you're looking at clear-cut favorite. I don't know how close the Big Ten race even ends up becoming. But you also look at it on the other hand, and Michigan State played 1 road game since the new year, and it was at Purdue, and they lost by 29 points to a team that has not been all that impressive outside of that game. So it's hard to really tell what to make of Michigan State, but they're definitely playing well, and they're doing that without really Cassius Winston even being at his best right now. So you have to always look out for that X factor.
Yeah, and the other road game that they played so far in Big Ten play, they beat Northwestern, but it was a 5-point win. So it's not like they've been, they did win at Seton Hall in the season. That was a 3-point game. So it's not like they've gone on the road and really throttled anybody. The Indiana matchup to me is interesting in that last year, basically the only Big Ten team Indiana could beat was Michigan State. And so there's going to be, from the Indiana perspective, some confidence, I guess, from what happened last year. With Michigan State, the interesting thing to me when I kind of look at their roster, and maybe this is just my lack of familiarity from watching them. We know Cassius Winston, we know Xavier Tillman on a game-to-game basis for the most part, what you're going to get out of those guys. The rest of the equation to me, I know in the preseason when we did our top 25 Big Ten players list, we were really high on Aaron Henry. That hasn't exactly materialized as we projected so far. And then beyond that, there's a lot of guys who are young, stepping into new roles. And, that may have something to do with the fact that they haven't been great on the road so far, because a lot of these guys just don't have that experience of being in these environments. How I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Cassius Winston and Xavier Tillman because everyone knows what great players they are. But the rest of the supporting cast, who has stuck out in your mind, and which of those guys, like, if Michigan State's going to go on the road this week and win 2 games, who are the guys that really need to kind of give them, be that 3rd, 4th consistent option?
So it's hard not to start with Aaron Henry. He's a guy who, if you talk to anyone around that program all the time, they think he's good enough to be a pro. Michigan State, they're really hard on him too. He takes a lot of the blame when this team doesn't play well. He has not played particularly well in Big Ten play. He has just a 86.3 offensive rating. He's shooting 37% on 2s and 24% on 3s. But I think everyone up there believes that if this team is going to be the kind of team that can make a run deep into the NCAA tournament, Henry's going to have to play really well. And he does have games where he looks great, and then he has games where he just can't really find his confidence. And it's just so hard to figure out what to expect from him on any given game, right? So he has all the talent in the world, and he's capable of taking over a game in a big spot. He's really improved his playmaking. He plays really well kind of in that 1-2 dribble range in the middle of the paint where he can either shoot or pass. But then he'll play a game like at Purdue where it looks like he doesn't even show up, gets in foul trouble, turns the ball over, can't make a shot. So what you're going to get from Aaron Henry on any given day is a wild card. And if you get the good version of Aaron Henry, Michigan State's really hard to play against because he has all the tools. So that is really the X factor. And it has really been drilled home over and over again in the media, right? Like there's been a lot of attention on Aaron Henry and just what he can be. So that is where you have to look first.
How do you? It seems like Izzo's not shy about picking out one or two guys like he's going to put a lot on in a given season. How do you think that plays into some of the struggles, because he's only a sophomore? I think maybe we got a little bit ahead of ourselves with Henry last year because he did look so good at times, and then he's showing up on draft boards. But you have to remember this wasn't like a 5-star blue chip recruit, really. This was a guy that, had a slew of Big Ten offers, but he wasn't like your typical top 100 kid. And, it's maybe he's being held to a higher standard than, he should be at this point. I mean, does it seem like some of the pressure and some of the expectations have weighed on him to this point?
I would definitely say that they've weighed on him. And I think Tom Izzo probably has a reputation for kind of breaking guys down to build them back up. This is sort of just what happens, I think, for wings at some part in their development at Michigan State. And usually they come out for the better. I also think it's really hard when you're a freshman playing 35 minutes a game in the NCAA tournament on a team that goes to the Final Four. You're just automatically expected to be that next version of yourself, right? And that's a 5-6 game stretch in March where you played great, but to be able to do that over the course of an entire conference season is a whole nother challenge altogether. So he's just constantly judged by this player that everyone thinks he can be or thinks that he should be or has been, but it's hard to get to that point consistently, especially when there's a lot more attention on you. So it's been a tough road for him, I would say, this year.
I think the other interesting thing in this game to me, and I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective, Indiana's been playing these lineups with Trace Jackson Davis and Joey Brunk, two big guys. It's kind of been hit or miss to me at times, their success. Obviously, they're a team that needs to get the ball in the paint and get fouled to find anything consistent offensively, because this team clearly just can't shoot. But with Michigan State, obviously Xavier Tillman's going to be one of their front court players, but Marcus Bingham is another guy who's young, 6'11", sophomore. And then the rest of their front court situation in terms of backup minutes at the power forward and center seems to kind of be, I don't know. Those guys all seem to be inconsistent. I mean, how big do you think it's going to be for them to get some production beyond Tillman in this game, especially against an opponent like Indiana that, they emphasize getting the ball in the paint, and they have two guys, obviously Jackson Davis and Brunk are not going to go out and get, I don't think 20 or 25 in this game, but they could easily go out and get, 10 to 15 points, and both of them are capable scorers at the rim.
Yeah, so Xavier Tillman, I would say, I know Cassius Winston's the player of the year candidate, but Tillman's probably their most important player. You basically can't take him off the floor for Michigan State because he's so important to what they do on offense and defense. So him staying out of foul trouble is always really important, but he's done a really good job of that this year. I think he's only averaging 2 fouls per 40 minutes in Big Ten games, which is a pretty ridiculous number for a big man playing those sort of minutes. And he's so important because he basically makes up for whoever's playing next to him. Like Michigan State's comfortable to play 2 bigs, but I don't think they really trust anyone else that's going to be on the court next to him. It's sort of just mix and match and hope you find the guy who plays well on that night. Marcus Bingham has a lot of potential. He has a lot of length. He can block shots, and I think he's actually more comfortable in a game against a team that plays 2 bigs. So he is probably in a good spot, I would say, against Indiana, and his rim protection can be helpful when he's not being forced to guard on the perimeter. Mm-hmm. From there, it's sort of just mix and match. Malik Hall is a 6'7" freshman. He hit 3 threes at Seton Hall early in the year and then has kind of just disappeared. He has been up and down, foul prone, struggling to find a role. Thomas Kithier has been kind of Mr. Reliable for Michigan State, but he has struggled of late and has not played all that well. Julius Marble is a guy who I think a lot of people up there are hoping plays more minutes. He is another 6'8" guy. But look, all those guys, they'll play in the system, they'll do their best, but I don't think any of them are game changers, right? I think because they have so much depth at that spot, though, that they can get enough from that group.
Yeah. What about the freshman Rocket Watts? He's a guy that, he's obviously one of those top 50 guys that came in. His overall numbers for this season don't look great when you look at it. He was 12 of 46 on threes, 26%. But then you take a little bit of a deeper dive of what he's done recently. He scored 10 points, obviously, in the loss at Purdue, but then he had bounced back and had 11, 3 3-pointers in that win over Wisconsin. He seems like a guy to me with Josh Langford being out, we know he's not coming back. So they need, beyond Henry, Tillman, and this is going to be a Final Four team. I'm saying they need to get consistently 4 or 5 guys that are showing up on a game to game basis. And to me, the talent profile is there with Watts. Does it feel like to you, just from looking at these numbers that he's put up recently, that he's maybe starting to figure out maybe he's going to turn a corner here soon?
Yeah, so Rocket Watts came in and played like he was still playing high school basketball on a team loaded with 5 stars, and he was just gunning from day one, right? So yeah, he shot 33% on twos and 21% on threes over his first 8 games. And then he had a stress reaction in his foot. He missed 4 games, and kind of sitting out for December really helped him, I think, just in terms of seeing the game, seeing what's expected of him. And since he's come back, he's shooting 65% on twos and 35% on threes. So that's a huge improvement, and he's doing that against better competition, right? They love his defense. He's a great athlete, and he has a lot of natural ability. So I do think, like, as the season goes along, he can ramp into a more important role as things go along, and he has plenty of talent to do that because Michigan State doesn't really have another quick, like, short guard, right? Especially as a great defender. And he can take some of the pressure off of Cassius Winston to guard opposing point guards, things of that nature. But as far as missing Langford, I think you have to point out that Gabe Brown has been really, really good, especially in the Big Ten. He is a lanky wing, but he really plays the 2 guard for Michigan State, and he's shooting 42% from 3 in the league. And
good free throw shooter.
He's a good free throw shooter. He basically plays in that Matt McQuaid role where he's going to just be posted up in the corner, and you have to stay on him or he'll hit a 3. But he adds the element of, if you close out too hard, he will blow by you and dunk on you at the basket, which is something that Matt McQuaid was not really all about. So that is his development has been really key. Early in the year, I don't think he had the complete trust of the Michigan State staff, and they wanted more from him on defense, really just to be more locked in and serious all the time. But he's playing more minutes now, making shots, and really growing into a nice piece on the wing.
What, in your mind, does Michigan, looking ahead to kind of the future of this program, obviously it's been the Cassius Winston program for the last 3-4 years. I mean, even go back to his freshman year, he was a big part of the puzzle. But really the last 3 years, he's been if not their most important player, among their most important players. And this is it for him. How do you think this program's set up for the future? After, I would assume that he's out of here after obviously he's a senior, but Tillman probably gone after this year too, potentially. I mean, how does this roster, look into the future? How do you feel like it sets up for success in the Big Ten? Do you think there's the pieces to kind of continue the Michigan State way of winning?
Yeah, I think Xavier Tillman is the huge X factor. I would never assume that a Michigan State player is going to leave early because it just happens. So it doesn't seem to happen all that often. And Tillman is really good and has progressed in a way that I didn't really necessarily expect early in his career. And he's coming to the point where his ability to make plays, rebound, defend, shoot, you could build an entire team around him next year, and you could look more like a Michigan State team built around Draymond Green, right? So
that's what I was going to say. There's a little? It feels like there's a little Draymond Green in his game now that he's become more of a, not just a guy that you throw it down in too, but he's he's making plays for other guys, and that's out of a 6'8", 245-pound player that you don't see that often.
No, and that's definitely there's sort of like two tracks for Michigan State, right? Like there's the scoring guard, like the Kalen Lucas, Cassius Winston, Drew Neitzel, like that development path. But then there's also the playmaking big in the form of Draymond Green, and I think that's where Tillman's going. And Michigan State has some roster issues next year. Don't really have a point guard that they trust, but Tillman's development, like he's going to be one of the best players in the Big Ten if he's back next year. And I'm not sure how you build a team around him, but I certainly think you could build a pretty good one. So I wouldn't worry that much about their talent, but the point guard is the big question mark after Cassius Winston.
Absolutely.
Hey, it's Jerod. I'm going to butt in here real quick because it is time to remind you about our friends at homefieldapparel.com, an apparel business that was launched by IU grads that is based in Indianapolis, and they are the place that delivers the most comfortable, the most unique IU apparel that you will find anywhere. And I just keep reiterating it, not just because they pay us, although of course they pay us for these spots, but because it's really true. You know, like I wouldn't need to order new stuff from them all the time, pay my own money for it, if I really didn't like it. And I absolutely do. You know, I got the crew neck sweater for the first time. That is so comfortable. I got the long sleeve tee for the first time. Man, I love my long sleeve tee. I got the little Script Indiana one. I wear it all the time. And it's kind of one of those things where I'm now ready to like get a second one or a third one so that even if there's a little bit of a delay in doing laundry at our house, I've always got one ready to go because there have been a few times where I'm like, hey, I want to wear the long sleeve tee, and it's not there because it's really comfortable. Obviously, I love the Script Indiana logo, but you know, whatever your sensibility is in terms of logos, whatever your style is, they've got something for you there at homefieldapparel.com. The stuff is so comfortable. It maintains its comfort even after you wash it. And they've just got these great old school logos that you can't find anywhere, like the Bison logo and the old basketball shoes logo. And they put out all these new football designs, new old football designs, celebrating some classic Indiana football seasons during the year. And they've even got a women's cut t-shirts. So if you don't just want the traditional style t-shirt, but you want one specifically designed for women's bodies, they've got that too. So much there at homefieldapparel.com. And when you use the promo code BRINK, BRINK, you will get 20% off your order, the entire order, like everything that you put in your shopping cart, 20% off. So go to homefieldapparel.com, get whatever you need to get you through the rest of the winter, start getting prepared for the spring and summer. That means hoodies, that means t-shirts, whatever you need, they've got it at homefieldapparel.com. Homefieldapparel.com, promo code BRINK, BRINK. Now back to Alex and Dylan.
You know, Indiana, this is going to be a tough game, obviously, on Thursday night, but in many ways, it doesn't get easier because Sunday they host Maryland, who's another team that last night they went to Northwestern and looked like I mean, how do you just even describe what the first half versus the second half? I mean, it's like I think I texted you at halftime, or we were messaging, and it was like a 14 or 16 point game, and I'm like, are they really going to lose to Northwestern? And then all of a sudden, I don't know what Turgeon said to him at halftime, or maybe they just decided to start playing, but they win pretty easily there going away in the second half. They're to me one of the tougher teams to figure out, but they're coming to Bloomington on Sunday too in a rematch of a game that Indiana, quite frankly, it was I think a 3 or 4 or 5 point game early in the second half, and then got down by 30 in that game. It wasn't really close. So what do you make of Maryland at this point, based on just everything they've got going right now, which doesn't seem like things are in a great place if you're losing by 14 or 16 at halftime at Northwestern.
Yeah, it was a crazy game where they only made 1 2-point field goal in the first half against Northwestern of all teams. You don't really expect to ever see that, and Maryland's probably one of the hardest teams to figure out in the league. There's this perception that they're just not good, but they have a top 10 defense. They're top 10 on KenPom. They're 5-3 in the Big Ten. They've won some wins over Ohio State,
conference games,
Marquette, Illinois. So they shouldn't be a bad team, and they're really solid defensively. The problem has just been that they can't make jump shots, and they have a couple guys who are on the team just to make jump shots. And when those guys aren't making jump shots, it's tough. They have a great point guard. Jalen Smith has improved his game basically across the board. He has been a monster of late. He dominated that second half against Northwestern. He's shooting 54% from three in Big Ten games. So, like, this team should be good. I think it's scary that they're still this good shooting this poorly. If guys like Ayala and Wiggins start making threes more consistently, this team could be really good. The question then becomes, why aren't they making threes? And are they just not that good as shooters? But they were both good shooters last year. So I don't know what to make of Maryland, but I don't know how well that they travel as a team, right? They have not played well on the road, and that's the good news for Indiana coming up.
Yeah, I mean, they were 0-4 in true road games going into last night, and it looked like they were headed quickly towards 0-5. They're not going to be able to come out and play that poorly in the first half and get away with it in Bloomington. I don't feel like. What role does just I feel like Maryland. I feel like these conversations. Jerod and I have these conversations every year about Maryland on the podcast. There was a year, I think it was when Indiana won the Big Ten in 2015-16, where they were. I think that was the year they had like Suleiman and Diamond Stone, and Layman and Melo Trimble. And they were like preseason top 5-10, and then the last game of the season, I know they came to Bloomington and Indiana just beat them by 20. Like, it wasn't even they weren't good that year, and I mean, they were a solid team, but they didn't live up to expectations. It feels like the common denominator though with this is like they have a lot of talent every year, and it's the same coach as Turgeon. Where are you?
That was like the peak Turgeon year. They were 22-3 and finished 27-9. So that was about as Mark Turgeon as it gets.
And I feel like Turgeon sometimes gets like, it's almost like people go too far to the extreme. Like they want to call him like a bad coach because every year Maryland kind of fails to meet expectations. It's not like Maryland's a doormat in the Big Ten. That they've been a pretty solid program. I just think that maybe as overall as a program, they have aspirations to be greater than this. I mean, is this? I mean, in terms of talent, I feel like this is the second best team in the league. If they don't do something this year, you have to start to wonder, is it ever going to happen with this guy? And I'm not saying he's a bad coach. I don't know where you kind of stand on him, but it's just.
Yeah, Maryland's won double-digit Big Ten games in 4 of the 5 years that they've been in the Big Ten with Turgeon.
Yeah.
I like to say that Maryland fans are never going to be happy with Mark Turgeon because he can't win the ACC when his team's in the Big Ten. So I feel like that they just expect that they should win double-digit games because it's just the Big Ten, and they desperately still want to be an ACC team. But it comes down to the fact that, the expectations are always go win the league, go make an NCAA tournament run, and instead it's a pretty good team that gets a double bye in the Big Ten tournament and then loses after a couple of games in the NCAA tournament. Like, what Maryland season has ended on a high note. That's the problem for Mark Turgeon, and it's hard to be excited.
Last year they lost. Was it LSU? Was it like the second round, or was that Sweet 16? That was second round.
Second round. The Diamond Stone team actually did make the Sweet 16, but
it's almost kind of like what Crean did at IU, but without the Big Ten championships in many ways.
Yeah, which is a pretty big. But like winning a Big Ten is like winning a Big Ten regular season is one of the hardest things I think to do as a basketball coach. So I don't know what to make of it. They do have talent. I even think their team fits together really well. Like Cowan and Jalen Smith are a good pick and roll pair. Wiggins and Ayala are the kind of guys you want to spread the floor.
I just don't know if Wiggins, Ayala, and Morcell are like good enough to be like the third, fourth, and fifth best player on a team that goes to like an Elite Eight. That's like my problem. Those guys, I mean, they were good last year, but now they've kind of got bigger roles, right? And they haven't really, their production hasn't kind of matched the role that they are playing right now. Especially like Ayala is shooting 23% on threes on 85 attempts. Wiggins 32 is a little bit better on 101 attempts, but I mean, those guys, like you said, if they don't start making threes, this team's just a two-man show, and I don't feel like a great recipe for winning on the road.
Yeah, it depends how you look at it. Ayala's shooting 15% from three in the Big Ten. but Maryland's 5-3, and he shot 41% from three last year. So
Yeah.
if he has any sort of regression back toward his average, even if you say he should be a career 38% shooter, then he's due to get hot here in a hurry. Or you could say something's just seriously wrong. He just can't make a shot, and his season's just gonna tank, right? Like, it's one of those things where how do you gauge a guy not making jump shots? It could be a good thing if they start going in and they regress toward the mean. So that's always the hard part with shooting, I think, especially 3-point shooting when there's a track record of perimeter shooting success. But look, the Maryland defense is legit. They don't foul, which is a big thing against Indiana, who gets to the free throw line quite a bit. They force a lot of turnovers. They can defend inside. Like, it's a good defensive team, and that is something that should travel, which is why it's disappointing that they've just fallen completely flat every time they've gone on the road.
Yeah, not to oversimplify either one of these games, but you look at the turnover percentages for all three teams. Michigan State's 12th in league play in turnover percentage. Maryland's 13th. Indiana's 14th. So for Indiana, I feel like in both games, they're going to, if they are able to take care of the ball a little bit better, I think that can definitely help them, especially being at home. I mean, I feel like when you throw the ball just out of bounds, you pick up these unforced turnovers. That's a good way to take your home crowd out of it. So, and rebounding too. I mean, Indiana, everyone thinks about Michigan State being a great rebounding team. Right now, Indiana's, and I know they haven't played the toughest schedule. They've played the second toughest schedule, or second worst schedule of any Big Ten team so far. But they're second in offensive rebounding percentage in the league and first in defensive rebounding percentage. So I think turnovers and rebounding in both of these games are going to tell us a big part of how they turn out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and you can't turn the ball over against Michigan State because their transition fast break is just as good as it gets, even off of makes, right? So you have to be locked in on transition defense. You have to control the tempo, and I was up there for the Michigan State game, and Michigan just didn't do that, and that's how you let the game get away against a team like Michigan State. But if you can take away some of those easy things, the putbacks, the transition, kind of make the game be played on your terms, then you can beat Michigan State. And for Indiana, look, this Michigan State at home, Maryland at home, those are the games that make your season, right? Yep. If you're going to make the NCAA tournament, you have to beat teams like Michigan State, like Maryland on your home floor. Because you don't want to set the expectation that you're going to have to go out and win those games on the road. So go ahead, get it done at home, and all of a sudden your resume looks pretty great at the end of January, right? So this is a huge spot for Indiana. You just have to protect home court given how difficult winning on the road in the conference has been. And you're not going to get a better spot, really, I don't think.
So one of the things you talked about with Brendan on the moving screen this week was the Big Ten and the NCAA tournament, and the potential for. I mean, I think realistically, there's a chance that 10 or 11 teams could get in. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think it's possible. Where right now, which teams do you feel like are solidly in the tournament, and then which teams do you feel like have the most work to do to kind of get there? I mean, obviously Indiana's in that spot. Minnesota, Purdue. I mean, it's. I think the problem is I think the one thing that Indiana is going to have on some of these teams is like a Minnesota or a Purdue. It feels like the losses for those two teams are really starting to pile up when you look at. I mean, Purdue's all the way down to 27th in KenPom, which that's a pretty big fall for them. They've got 9 losses. At some point, the number of losses starts to really become a factor. So I'm just kind of your big picture thoughts on where the Big Ten is as a league right now in terms of the potential amount of bids they could get.
Yes. So basically 12 of the 14 teams are legitimately in the conversation to make the NCAA tournament, which is a ridiculous stat as it is. The issue is that it's really hard to feel safe about making the NCAA tournament when it's so easy to go on a 4 or 5 game losing streak in this conference, right? And that can change everything. Just like And if you're a team that is looking kind of on the outside, like you say, a Minnesota or a Purdue, it's really easy to go, and every game you're playing is basically a chance to pick up quality wins. So if you can win 5 games in a row, like Illinois changed its entire season over the last month by winning 5 Big Ten games in a row, right?
Yeah.
So that, or I guess I think they've won 5 in a row. So that opportunity is great, but it's also hard to ever really feel safe. I do think Minnesota really hurt itself in the non-conference. They played a lot of games that were difficult, but not difficult enough to kind of brush off the resume. So they have a lot of sort of mediocre losses in the non-conference and not a lot to show for it. Purdue is, I just can't really make sense of Purdue, but it's hard to imagine this team, given how poorly they play on offense, getting out of this hole.
I mean, look at the road games they have left. They still got to go to Rutgers, IU, Ohio State, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and they've already got 9 losses total. And you don't feel necessarily great about them holding serve at home either, based on the fact that they lost to Texas and Illinois already on their home court. I mean, I don't think they're going to win out at home, right?
And you look at, you say, oh, well, they beat Virginia, but that doesn't hold up much anymore. So, right. Exactly. They've already lost at Nebraska.
I mean, their best non-conference win was VCU, and VCU's probably a tournament team, but it's no sure thing.
And if the question becomes how many Big Ten teams can claim wins over Purdue as their quality wins if they eventually fall out of the picture, right? Right. I do think Purdue is at risk of falling here. I think Minnesota might have a little better chance than them just because they seem to be at least still trending in the right direction to me.
That was the funny thing about IU. Right now, they're in the computers. They're 12th of the 14 Big Ten teams by most of the computer rankings. But then I saw a graphic the other day with, I don't know what team it was, but it showed Indiana as one of their quality wins. So it's kind of like at some point it's like this whole, Indiana's thing right now. Everybody's saying they're 4-3, but they're 3 of their 4 wins are Northwestern and Nebraska, which is true. But it's like, all right, they've got 13 games left, and pretty much every game that they play from now on is a chance to get a good win and not necessarily a bad loss. So they, I feel like they would be ahead of Purdue and Minnesota in the pecking order just from the standpoint of they have some decent non-conference. I mean, the Florida State win's obviously going to be a feather in their cap for the duration. And then, if they can just win some home games, it's not hard for me to see them making it in at something like 8-12 or 9-11 in the Big Ten based on how weak the rest of the bubble is. Would you agree with that?
The games are there to win. You just have to get to that number, right? I mean, right. Every game left that Indiana plays is going to be a positive impact on its resume. The
unless they just get slaughtered at home or something, right?
Yeah, the downside is that there's no gimmies. Sometimes it's nice to just win a game where, even if it's not a great resume game, right? It's hard to keep your confidence up when you're playing good teams every single night. Just following Michigan, Michigan's going through a stretch like that right now. They haven't played Nebraska or Northwestern yet, and all of a sudden they're sitting at 2-4 in the conference. So it is easy to get out ahead of your skis a little bit and lose control when there's no time to come up for air, right?
But that's go ahead, sorry.
What if you lose to Iowa on a Thursday night at home, and then you have to turn around and go to Michigan and Minnesota, right? That's an easy way to just fall into a losing streak.
Right.
Because all these other teams, they're playing for the exact same thing, right? And they're so even that there's just not really any separation.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, even with Northwestern and Nebraska, you want to say, you want to circle that on your schedule and say, well, that's a game we should win. But then, last night, obviously, Maryland won that game, but it wasn't like they just went in there and took them to the woodshed. And the other, Nebraska, I mean, I know they had some horrible losses, but they've beaten Purdue and Iowa at home. It's not like they're incapable of beating anybody. So I know you said those are kind of, it's nice to have a game like that. I don't really know that there are, unless you get one of those teams at home. I don't know that there are any games like that the rest of the year. Right? I mean,
they're not gimmies in the sense of Rutgers a few years ago when they were a 250th level team, right? I mean,
exactly.
Nebraska can beat you, especially at home. Northwestern, they're going to play tough. They're going to make it an ugly game. I mean,
I mean, they only lost by 4 on the road the other night at Illinois. It's not like they're not just laying down. I mean, I give them a little credit for fighting, I guess, but I mean,
the hottest team in the Big Ten.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a bloodbath, and I think it's just if you can get to 10 wins in the conference, really, if you're anyone, I think you can feel good about where you're at. And I think it's going to be hard for many teams to get past that by much, just because of how difficult it is to win on the road in the league. And we haven't even talked about the Big Ten tournament, which is going to be crazy for all of this.
I mean, there's going to be
NCAA
good teams playing on. There's going to be good teams playing on Wednesday in the Big Ten tournament. I can't remember. I mean, it used to be like Penn State was a team that you could count on. Maybe if they were coming into your place, it was going to be a pretty easy win. Like you said, Rutgers, even Nebraska at times, early when they first joined the Big Ten. But then they had some good years. But yeah, it's just, I mean, Minnesota, was it 2 years ago? They weren't there was a stretch there where Minnesota wasn't very good for a couple of years either. So, but yeah, there's just no off nights. I want to ask you quickly about a couple teams. First, we'll start with Michigan, your team you cover. They've got Penn State at home tonight. I've been getting a little crap on my power rankings for keeping them as high as I have, but I also like to point out to people that they've played a ridiculously tough schedule so far in league play, and they're without, I think you can make an argument, their second most important player in Isaiah Livers. Where do they go from here? Because obviously the schedule is going to ease up here. It feels like to me, if they're going to kind of make a run here and get, in the top 2 or 3 in the league, this is the stretch they need to do it in.
Yeah, so Michigan has played 4 of its first 6 on the road. As I said, they haven't played Northwestern or Nebraska, and they've been without Isaiah Livers since the middle of December. Mm-hmm. So not a great combination. But now just basically put up or shut up time. They play, I think, 5 of their next 6 are either at home or Madison Square Garden. And they play at Nebraska in that stretch. So basically,
they gotta win that game.
You have to start winning these games, because if you lose some of these games, there's not really a point to make them up, right? Michigan's going to, again, play 4 of its final 6 on the road. So you don't want to be trying to make up ground coming down the stretch if you're Michigan. So Michigan just has to win some of these games, like Penn State at home, Illinois at home, at Nebraska, Rutgers at Madison Square Garden. If you win some of those, really all of those, then you feel a lot better about where you stand. But I think a lot comes down to Isaiah Livers' health. Sounds like he's still probably going to be out tonight against Penn State. But Michigan's just not the same team without him, really just because of how much flexibility he gives the rotation. He allows them to really play small or big and just provide a lot of defensive flexibility and allow Michigan's bench players to be bench players, not stretch starters. So he's a key factor, but it's easy to say, okay, you've played a hard schedule, but that means now when the schedule gets easier, you have to turn around and win. Otherwise, that unravels really quickly. So that's where Michigan's at right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big week for them. They got Penn State and Illinois at home. I mean, those are 2 games I'd say they need to win both of them. But the other thing, we talked about this a little bit the other day when we were just chatting, but who signed off on this whole let's play Rutgers twice in their backyard, one at the rack and one at MSG, twice within a span of 19 days? How does this happen?
So it is a Big Ten thing. This Big Ten day, they play a
hockey, right? Too
basketball, hockey doubleheader at Madison Square Garden. I think one year it was wrestling. Michigan played in it, I think 3 years ago against Penn State, and that was a Penn State home game. Okay. I don't know the specifics of who plays in this event is organized, but I do know that Michigan under John Beilein definitely prioritized playing in New York City. I think Michigan's won its last 12 games in a row at Madison Square Garden. They like to schedule games there. Does it seem like a great move to play your home game against a team that's down the road? Not really, but
when you first told me they were playing there, before I looked at the schedule, I was like, "Oh, that's a Rutgers home game." And then I looked, and it's like, "Oh, wait, they go to the rack less than 3 weeks later." So,
yeah, so that's tough, especially because Rutgers has been playing so well. On the other hand, if you can win the game, it's going to be a locked Q1 game more than a Q2 game, which it would probably be at home. So that helps a bit. But yeah, it's a tough spot. So Michigan's only playing 9 home games in the Big Ten, where home games are worth their weight in gold.
Yeah. What's going on with Ohio State from your perspective? 5 of 6. When I watched them up close in Bloomington, Indiana played well to start that game, but then they had their typical Indiana stretch where they didn't do anything offensively for 7 or 8 minutes, and Ohio State really still couldn't even get over that. It feels like they're okay. Since the Kentucky game, the only team they've beaten is Nebraska. It's not like they've had terrible losses. They played good teams, but for the 12th ranked team in Ken Palm, I think that's what they are right now. You would expect a little bit better than this. They seem like a mess right now. They've had some suspensions. Their guard situation. It was bizarre to me when they played the game at IU. Dwayne Washington started, and then Holtman took him out at midway through the first half at one point, and then I don't think he came back in the game. So their guard situation seems to be a pretty pressing issue that they need to figure out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, on one hand, you can say, okay, they lost to West Virginia on a neutral. That's a great team. Wisconsin at home. Wisconsin's one of the 2 teams that has a road win in the conference over a team other than Northwestern and Nebraska. Yep. Maryland on the road, Indiana on the road, Penn State on the road. There's on the surface, there's nothing really outlandish about that, right? You would say if those games are spread across the season, they might all have been losses for Ohio State anyways.
Yeah.
But you look a little closer and you start to worry that something's just broken with this team. I think DJ Carton was so good early in the year, so good against Kentucky, and he's just completely fallen apart. He's turning the ball over all the time. He's just struggling, and CJ Walker is not playing much better. So something seems a little off with them, and that's the scary part because, yeah, it's not surprising to lose those games to those teams, but how a team handles that and how a team can ride out that losing streak and whether it starts to kind of crack somewhere, right? Whether it's in the locker room. I don't know what's wrong with this team, but something is clearly not working, and that's a scary place to be in when you have to turn it around quickly.
Yeah. Originally, when they started to lose some games, it was, Kyle Young is out. That's hurting us. And then he's come back, and he came back for the Indiana game, played 22 minutes, scored 1 point, and then he played better against Nebraska, but then he played 14 minutes at Penn State, didn't score. He's obviously somewhat critical, but to me, it's their backcourt. He's got to make a decision, I feel like, between – does he want the scoring that Washington gives him, or does he want the defense that Muhammad gives him? Because I feel like they're, if you could take those 2 guys and make them one player, you'd have something. But Muhammad is just so limited, I feel like, offensively, and Washington just almost seems to me indifferent on playing defense at times. That's how I looked seriously in the Indiana game. Indiana had been struggling offensively, and they just came out and just popped him right in the mouth. And I think he was. Obviously he only played 8 minutes, so they saw something there defensively they didn't like. They've got to figure out they've got 4 guys there. Certainly they can figure out 2 of those that they can roll with and get some consistency out of. But like you mentioned, DJ Carton, I just looked, he's got 23 turnovers in the last 6 games. That's ridiculous.
And a lot of them are just unforced, throwing the ball somewhere, just doing something you don't need to do. The craziest stat to me is that Ohio State's the best 3-point shooting team in Big Ten games, 37%, and they're 2-5.
Yeah,
they can't make 2s, and they turn the ball over all the time. It's just not a sustainable recipe, right? It's kind of like the opposite. Maryland is winning games while not making 3s. That makes them dangerous if 3s fall. The fact that Ohio State's already making 3s and still losing, that's a bit scary, I think. And this is a team that has had similar sort of, not collapses, but down stretches, right? Last year they lost 5 games in a row in the Big Ten in January again. So
yeah,
we've seen this before, and I don't quite know how to figure out what's causing it. And that's scary for a team. Again, is it a here we go again situation, or can they knock out of it? I don't know the answer.
It feels like they're still going to make the tournament. To me, it's just at one point it felt to me like they were going to be a 2 or 3 seed, and now it feels like they're going to be a lot lower. And the problem when you start out, when you consistently, like, this is kind of the same thing with IU in many ways, is that when you have these long periods in conference play where you just go on a losing streak, or you, the same thing happens over and over each season, and then I think people start to wonder, like, what's kind of going on. And in Ohio State, I mean, they've got the good thing for them is, at least for Holtman, is like he made the tournament the last 2 years, whereas with IU and Underwood, their first 2 years they completely missed. So I think he's got obviously some goodwill built up there. But I mean, for them, it's, if they don't get it turned around soon, they're probably what, like a 7-8 seed in the tournament if they continue on this path.
Yeah, and
that's not a formula to go very far. I mean, this year could be different in that anything can happen, but I mean it's a pretty big letdown, is what I guess I'll say, based on where they were at one point. If they would have kind of just taken care of business from there, they would have been looking at a much better season overall.
Yeah, and even Holtman, his first year, they kind of fell apart late in the year, right? Like that
Exactly.
Team, first round exit in the Big Ten tournament, second round exit in the NCAA tournament. So he is not. Most of his seasons have had a peak before the time when you want to peak in March, right? So that's probably the biggest worry as far as how he's regarded there, but also it's Ohio State, so I don't think anyone cares about anything other than the college football playoff. So
they're probably getting the depth chart ready for the spring game right now. They don't even know who's playing there this week. Quickly before we get out of here, I want to ask you about Big Ten Player of the Year race. It's obviously a little early to start talking about this, but some names that keep coming up, and Luka Garza at Iowa definitely has to be in the mix. Daniel Oturu, is he a name right now? I mean, I know they're not probably good enough as a team, but I'm looking at the Ken Palm top 5 right now. It's Garza, Wesson, Oturu, Jalen Smith, and Winston. It feels like you wrote an interesting newsletter on this a couple weeks ago. It feels like it's the year of the Big Ten, the big man in the Big Ten.
It is. I also still think the best player is point
Winston.
guard. So
yeah, exactly.
If Michigan State wins the league and is in position to do that, I don't see how anyone else wins Big Ten Player of the Year. So some of this conversation is probably just moot, but Luka Garza is fascinating to me because he is ridiculous offensively. His usage, his efficiency, his ability to score in all different ways. I mean, he's incredible, and seen that up close and personal, watching him just destroy Michigan in 2 games. So his other problem, though, is that he's a big reason why Iowa is not that good defensively. So he is not a two-way player, and I ding him a bit for that, just as far as how I regard him. I think Oturu is a much more complete player as far as his ability to impact the game on both ends of the court, and he's still pretty damn good offensively. So I would lean to giving him more of a nod ahead of Garza, but they're both been really, really good, and I think Oturu could be the top draft prospect in the Big Ten this year.
Right. I haven't seen him as high on some. I mean, there's different draft boards that I think have him up, but I haven't looked at the latest Draft Express, what ESPN, they're with ESPN now, but I haven't looked at the latest one yet. But to me, it feels like he needs to be like, it feels like if he's not being picked somewhere in the top 20, then somebody's not doing their job right. Am I wrong, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of an information delay as far as in the middle of the Big Ten season, like how long it takes someone to show up on mock drafts, right? Like, it's not like the NBA scouts are out here just calling up Jonathan Givony to tell him, look, this guy's a first-round pick, right? So I think by the time the dust settles at the end of the year, that dude's going to be a pro. Like, he's just too productive. He can hit shots. He can defend. He's a great athlete. He plays hard. Like, I don't see how he's not a first-round pick, honestly. Could be wrong, but if Jalen Smith is a first-round pick, Oturu has to be a first-round pick to me.
Yeah, and Garza's not even going to be an NBA player in my mind, so he's going to be around for another year next year to put up his ridiculous stat. He's second right now in Ken Palm's National Player of the Year ratings, which is crazy to me. Like, we had him, I think we had him in the top. Do we have him in the top 10, top 15 preseason? Which, I mean, who could have predicted what he's doing right now? But it's been, who's the besides Winston, who do you think's the second best guard in the Big Ten? It's a tough question right now, isn't it?
So
Cowan?
It is a tough question. I lean Xavier Simpson. I think he's been better offensively than Cowan this year. Simpson, I mean, Michigan's not playing well, but Simpson, his assist numbers are ridiculous this year. He's finishing more effectively. He's even hitting a few threes. I think he's just Michigan's entire offense right now, and the fact that Michigan's offense is still playing well without Isaiah Livers is a testament to how good Simpson is. So I would lean Simpson. I could definitely see Cowan picking up votes, especially if Maryland finishes pretty well ahead of Michigan, right? And I even think you have to give a shout out to Marcus Carr. He's been pretty good for Minnesota. Had some monster games in big spots. So he's up there as far as a two-way scoring guard, if you just look at his Big Ten numbers.
Is this finally the year that Rutgers gets somebody on one of the all Big Ten teams? I feel like it hasn't happened. I don't know. I'd have to look at that. Maybe Corey Sanders was on like a third team, but they're tough to... They're
tough to pick one person, right?
Exactly. Because they have like 4 or 5 dudes that do a bunch of different things. I feel like maybe now that Geo Baker's back, if he has a couple games where he's like the name, I guess, that everybody knows from Rutgers. But yeah, I mean, the dude, I can't say his name, that they got from Stony Brook as a grad transfers.
Yeboah.
Pretty good. Yeah, Yeboah. And then Miles Johnson has obviously been pretty good, but I mean,
Ron Harper Jr. is great.
Yeah.
He's probably my favorite player on that whole team. Jacob Young has been a little better of late, has kind of found his game without Geo Baker. So
yeah,
Rutgers is legitimately good. I mean, they have depth, but they're really balanced, and there's not a Corey Sanders figure to take all the shots. But that's also why Rutgers is a better team.
Right. What better way than to end this episode of Podcast on the Brink than talking about the Big Ten power from Piscataway, New Jersey, Rutgers.
Don't sleep.
Yeah, I know. I actually think it's good. It's good for the league overall to have them be, they were the butt of all jokes for how long in football and basketball. Now that they're actually a legit team in basketball.
Yeah, I wrote
to him. I mean, Pike Eels, I think that's how you say his name. I remember watching him when Indiana went to the tournament in 2016. This was actually his last game with Stony Brook. He was coaching Stony Brook against Kentucky, and they played the game before Indiana did, because Kentucky played the second game. And I just remember watching him and thinking, man, this guy knows what he's doing. And then he inherited quite the mess from, those Eddie Jordan Rutgers teams that were like complete joke. And
nothing will ever top. Michigan played at Rutgers in a year where Michigan had a bunch of injuries. They had like 6 guys healthy. Michigan won the game barely, like 52-50. Eddie Jordan comes out after the game and says we just couldn't keep up with their depth. And I was like, that is the end of the Eddie Jordan era here at Rutgers. And
the funny part was they had like a game under Eddie Jordan where they beat that like really good Wisconsin team. Remember that? That has to be one of the most improbable Big Ten wins since we've been doing this stuff. I mean, that was a horrible team, and they beat, I think it was the Frank Kaminsky, Sam Decker Wisconsin team. So yeah,
that win, and then I think probably the Penn State win over that 2013 Michigan team were two of the biggest conference upsets I can think of. But Rutgers, I did a newsletter about them because that's just the biggest fan base that we have to cater to in the Big Ten here. But they are the number 1 team in the country, according to Bart Torvik, since December 11th, I believe it is. So that's pretty crazy about how well they've really been playing of late. And their defense has just been elite. They have the best defense in the Big Ten, and that's a Big Ten that has Michigan State, has Maryland, has Purdue, has all these defenses that are really good. They get after it, and I do think there's a bit of 3-point luck. They give up a lot of threes, and they give up a lot of 3-point attempts, but they haven't been going in. That's something to watch as the season goes on if they do hit a rough patch. But I give Pike a lot of credit. I feel like his teams have always played hard as hell. They just weren't all that good, and he's finally got enough guys in there that they're really buying into what he says and what he does. They're still limited offensively, but it's fun to have them in a position to make the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I mean, their next 3 home games, too, it's like, I mean, their schedule to close the season is brutal, but their next 3 home games are Nebraska, Purdue, and Northwestern. And then, obviously, they got that Michigan game. It counts as a home game for Michigan, but that'll be somewhat in their backyard. I mean, I think at this point, it's going to be hard for them to miss the NCAA tournament, which is something
crazy to say in the middle of January.
Rutgers. So before, how can people subscribe to the new newsletter? There's a lot of good info in that, so I don't want people to miss out on that. What's the easiest way to get that?
Yeah, you can. I link it in my Twitter quite a bit. I'll have you link it in here, but you can also just go to big10newsletter.com and you can sign up there. So that's a nice, easy little shortcut. Cool.
It's free. It's good information every week. It's not only Michigan or IU. It's everybody around like I said, go back. I think if you go on the website, right, there's an archive. There's a really good post from a couple weeks ago about all the big guys in the league. And I remember when I was reading through and I was scrolling down and Miles Johnson was almost at the bottom. And I'm like, wow, this is a pretty good year for big guys in the Big Ten. If he's a pretty solid player for Rutgers. And there's just a lot of good information. So definitely check that out. Dylan, thank you for coming on. We enjoy the Moving Screen podcast with you and Brendan Quinn every week. Some good debate, good discussion on that every week, and I always enjoy your work over at UMHoops. So thanks for taking the time to join us this week on Podcast on the Brink.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.